The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the darkened streets of New York. Margaret pulled her tattered blanket tighter around her frail frame, seeking warmth against the cold night air. Beside her, Lucy, her small but fiercely loyal dog, curled up against her legs, shivering. She looked up at the vast, merciless sky and murmured, "We're still breathing, Lucy. That's a miracle in itself." Suddenly, Lucy stiffened, ears pricking up before darting towards a nearby alleyway, barking urgently. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she watched her companion disappear around the corner. With weary steps, she followed, pushing past an overturned trash bin and scattered debris. Then, she heard it. A sound that sent shivers down her spine. A baby's cry. Margaret's breath caught as she stepped closer to a large dumpster that seemed to be the source of the pitiful wailing. The rain intensified, the wind howling through the alley as she hesitated, fearing what she might find. Swallowing hard, she reached forward, pushing aside a heap of soaked rags. Beneath them lay a tiny infant, barely 2 months old, wrapped in a thin, tattered cloth. His tiny fists clenched and unclenched as his cries filled the alley, his little chest heaving with distress. "Oh, dear Lord." Margaret gasped, her voice cracking. Who could do such a thing? Her eyes fell upon a small silver bracelet around the child's wrist. Even in the dim light, she could make out the engraving. Thomas. Tears welled in her eyes as she cradled the baby to her chest, her own body trembling from something far deeper than the cold. "You're safe now, little Thomas," she whispered. "I don't have much, but I promise you this. You will never be alone again." Margaret held the tiny baby close, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. The rain continued to pour, soaking them both, but she didn't care. She had been a soldier once, she had seen war, faced death, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Lucy whimpered at her feet, circling anxiously as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Margaret looked down at the dog and then at the child in her arms. "We have to go, Lucy," she murmured. "He won't survive out here." With slow, cautious steps, she retreated from the alley, shielding the baby from the cold as best as she could. She didn't have a home, only the worn-out corners of the city that she knew well, but she had to find shelter somewhere, anywhere. She ended up in an abandoned warehouse, one of her usual hideouts. The walls were cracked, the air thick with dampness, but it was dry, and for now, it was safe. She settled into a pile of blankets she had stashed in the corner, unwrapping the baby just enough to examine him. Thomas's tiny face was pale, his lips trembling slightly as he breathed in shallow, uneven gasps. Margaret pressed a hand to his forehead, cold. "Too cold, God, help me," she whispered. Carefully, she pulled him closer, using her own body heat to warm him. She knew she had to find food, milk, something to keep him alive, but she couldn't leave him alone, not in a place like this. Lucy, as if sensing her distress, curled up against them, his warm fur pressing into Margaret's side. She sighed and ran a hand over Thomas's delicate head. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "I won't let anything happen to you." That night, as the storm raged outside, Margaret lay awake, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the child beside her. She had never thought her life would take this turn. Once, she had served her country, worn a uniform with pride. Now, she was just another forgotten soul on the streets, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her. A purpose. She had to survive not just for herself, but for Thomas. The morning light barely reached the cold, abandoned warehouse, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete floor. Margaret stirred, feeling the tiny weight of Thomas against her chest. He was warm now, his tiny breath steady, but the hunger in his weak cries was unmistakable. Margaret sat up slowly, her joints aching from the dampness. She had to find food for him. "Hang on, little one," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I won't let you go hungry." Lucy stretched beside her, wagging his tail as if trying to offer comfort. The dog had been with her for years, her only companion in this cruel world. And now, Thomas was part of their little family. Margaret wrapped Thomas in the warmest cloth she had and tucked him safely inside her coat. She had seen too much in her life, too many desperate people on these streets. She wouldn't risk leaving him behind. As she stepped outside, the city was already awake. Cars honked, people bustled along the sidewalks, most of them too lost in their own lives to notice an old homeless woman carrying a baby. She moved carefully, navigating through back alleys and side streets, heading toward the only place she knew she might find help, Sister Eleanor's soup kitchen. The small, worn-out church on 5th Street had always been a beacon for people like Margaret. Sister Eleanor, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s, never turned anyone away. As Margaret stepped inside, the warmth of the place embraced her like an old friend. "Margaret?" Sister Eleanor's voice carried across the room. The elderly nun approached, her sharp eyes landing on the bundle in Margaret's arms. "Dear Lord, what have you done?" Margaret exhaled, her hands tightening protectively around Thomas. "I found him in the trash," she said simply. "He was abandoned." Sister Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, dear. That poor child." She gently pulled back the blanket, her expression softening at the sight of Thomas's peaceful face. "He's beautiful." Margaret nodded. "But he's hungry. I don't know how to care for a baby." Sister Eleanor's gaze met hers, filled with something Margaret hadn't seen in a long time: understanding. "Come," she said. "Let's feed him first." Margaret followed her into the small kitchen, where the nun warmed a bottle of milk. As she watched Thomas drink hungrily, she felt a strange tightness in her chest. Love. Fear. Determination. She had no home, no money, no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would do whatever it took to keep Thomas safe. 10 years passed like the wind sweeping through the city streets, quiet, relentless, full of struggle but also of love. Thomas had grown into a bright, lively boy with eyes that held both curiosity and wisdom beyond his years. Though his clothes were tattered and his hands often dirted from the world he lived in, his spirit remained unbroken. Margaret, though older and frailer, had done everything she could to raise him well. They lived in the corners of the city where no one looked twice: abandoned buildings, makeshift shelters, and kind-hearted soup kitchens like Sister Eleanor's. But despite their hardships, Thomas had something that no wealth could buy: love. From a young age, he had shown a deep fascination with books. Every evening, he would sneak behind a classroom window at the local school, watching intently as the children learned to read and write. His small fingers would trace letters in the dirt, mimicking their movements, whispering words under his breath until he memorized them. One day, as he peeked through the classroom window, completely lost in the lesson, a voice startled him. "You know, you could just come inside." Thomas jumped, turning to see a middle-aged school teacher smiling at him. She wasn't angry. In fact, there was warmth in her eyes. I don't belong here," Thomas muttered, embarrassed. "Nonsense," the teacher said. "If you love learning that much, you should be in a classroom, not standing in the cold." That day, she handed him a book, his very first. And from that moment on, the world of knowledge became his greatest refuge. One evening, Thomas was on his way back to the small alley where he and Margaret stayed when he saw something unusual. A group of men in dark clothing was pulling a woman into a van. She struggled, her muffled screams barely reaching the streets. Without thinking, Thomas sprinted forward. "Hey! Stop!" he shouted, grabbing a rock and throwing it at the nearest man. The kidnappers turned in shock. Thomas was just a child, but his sudden intervention startled them enough to give the woman a chance to fight back. She kicked, twisted, and screamed louder. Someone from a nearby building noticed the commotion and shouted for help. Realizing they had lost the element of surprise, the kidnappers panicked and fled. Thomas rushed to the woman's side. "Are you okay?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and gratitude. She was elegantly dressed, her jewelry gleaming under the streetlights, clearly a woman of wealth. You saved me," she whispered. Before Thomas could respond, The sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrived, and soon, the kidnappers were caught. The woman, still shaken, turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. "I owe you my life," she said. "Please, let me help you." Thomas hesitated. He had never known kindness from someone like her, someone who belonged to the world of wealth and power. But when she insisted on meeting his guardian, he led her to the only home he had ever known, the small alley where Margaret and Lucy waited for him. As soon as the wealthy woman saw the old homeless lady standing protectively beside Thomas, something in her expression softened. "What if I give you both a home?" she asked. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't owe us anything," she said cautiously. The woman smiled gently. "No, dear. I think I do." Margaret hesitated. She had lived in the shadows for so long that stepping into the light of a wealthy home felt like an impossible dream. But as she looked at Thomas, his eyes wide with hope, his small hands clutching her sleeve, she knew she couldn't refuse. For the first time in years, they walked through doors that weren't broken or rusted. The woman, who introduced herself as Evelyn Sinclair, led them into her grand estate. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, soft carpets muffled their footsteps, and the air smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Thomas marveled at the towering bookshelves in the library, his fingers grazing the spines of leather-bound volumes. Evelyn chuckled at his amazement. "Do you like books, Thomas?" His face lit up. "I love them." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Then you can read as many as you want here." Margaret, watching from a distance, felt a strange emotion stirring inside her, gratitude, but also caution. Life had never been kind to her. She had learned to be wary of good fortune, for it was often followed by tragedy. Evelyn insisted that they stay, at least as her guests. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas flourished under her care. He was given proper clothes, a bed of his own, and books to devour. Margaret, though hesitant, found herself working as the housekeeper, a role she could accept without feeling like she owed anyone anything. But there was something about Evelyn, something hidden beneath her composed smile. Some nights, Margaret would find her staring out the window, lost in thought, her fingers tracing the delicate chain of a necklace she always wore. Then, on Thomas's birthday, at least, the day Margaret had chosen for him, they celebrated with a small cake. As Evelyn watched the boy blow out the candles, tears unexpectedly welled in her eyes. "If my son were alive," she whispered, "he would have been your age." Silence fell over the room. Margaret's heart pounded. Evelyn swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. 10 years ago, he was taken from me. Kidnapped. My husband. He refused to pay the ransom. And my boy. He never came home." Thomas froze, his wide eyes flickering with an emotion Margaret couldn't place. Margaret hesitated before speaking. "When did this happen?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Evelyn turned to her. "October 5th. It was raining that night." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. October 5th, a rainy night. A baby left in a dumpster, with nothing but a silver bracelet. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "There was something with Thomas when I found him," she said slowly. "A bracelet." Evelyn's body tensed. Her lips parted as if she couldn't breathe. "A bracelet," she repeated. "Do you still have it?" Margaret's hands shook as she reached into her old satchel, pulling out the only thing Thomas had when she found him. A small, worn silver bracelet. Evelyn lunged forward, snatching it with trembling fingers. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned the tiny band over. And there, beneath the grime and scratches, was the engraving she had never forgotten. "Thomas." Evelyn's knees buckled. A strangled sob escaped her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're my son." The room fell into a stunned silence. Thomas looked from the sobbing Evelyn to Margaret, his small hands clenching at his sides. He didn't understand, at least not fully, but he knew something enormous had just changed. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched Evelyn clutch the tiny silver bracelet like it was the most precious thing in the world. Tears streamed down the wealthy woman's face, her fingers trembling as they traced the worn engraving. "This can't be real." Evelyn choked, looking up at Thomas. You're really my son?" Thomas swallowed hard. I don't know," he stammered. His voice was small, uncertain. He turned to Margaret, his protector, his grandmother in every way but blood. "Grandma." Margaret felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had known this moment would come someday. She had always wondered about Thomas's real family. But now, standing on the edge of losing him, she realized just how much he had become her entire world. Evelyn reached out hesitantly, her hands hovering over Thomas's shoulders. "I thought I lost you forever," she whispered. "I grieved for you every day. I blamed myself. But you're here. You're alive." Thomas took a step back, unsure. His mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. Margaret, steadying herself, knelt beside him. "Thomas, listen to me," she said gently. "I found you that night in the rain. I didn't know where you came from or why you were there. But I knew one thing: you were meant to be loved." Thomas's lips quivered. "You never told me." "I didn't know the truth, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "All I knew was that you needed me. And I needed you." Evelyn wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered. "I had given up hope, but I never truly stopped." She turned to Margaret, her expression raw. "I don't even know what to say to you. You saved his life. You raised him. How do I ever repay you for that?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't do it for a reward," she said quietly. "I did it because I love him." Evelyn nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And I love him too. He's my son. But..." She looked at Thomas, who stood frozen between the two women who had both, in different ways, given him life. "I don't want to take him from you." Margaret blinked. "What?" Evelyn inhaled shakily. "You're the only mother he's ever known," she admitted. "You were there when I wasn't. I won't take that away from you." She turned to Thomas. "But I would love for you to be part of my life, Thomas. If you want that." Thomas looked between them, his young mind struggling to process the momentous truth that had just unfolded. But then, slowly, he looked at Margaret, then at Evelyn, and then back again. Finally, he spoke. "I don't want to lose either of you." Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And Evelyn, through her tears, smiled a smile filled with hope and love. "Then we won't ever be apart," Evelyn promised. "We'll be a family. A real family." Thomas's face finally broke into a teary smile as Evelyn pulled him into her arms. Margaret watched, her own eyes misty, but for the first time in years, her heart felt at peace. She had found Thomas in the rain. She had raised him, loved him as her own, and now, he had found his way home. Margaret reached down and gently scratched Lucy behind the ears. "Looks like we have a home now, boy." Lucy wagged his tail, as if he understood, and in that grand house, under the soft glow of the chandeliers, three souls who had been lost, Margaret, Thomas, and Evelyn, finally found where they truly belonged, together.